All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was the Sourceless Wonders with their new hit single, Sanity is Overrated. And absolutely, I have to agree with them on that one. That is the best song to remind everyone that sanity is indeed overrated, because you have to be insane to think that was a good song. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host, Alex Stake, and you're listening to the one and only radio station that you need to listen to in these times, Deadman Radio. Hello, everyone. How are you doing this afternoon? At least I think it's afternoon. It has been a while since I left this room. I know, that's concerning. It's a concerning thing to say. However, I've got good reason for it. I have been working tirelessly to go over these documents, go over this journal, and make sure that the stuff that we are showing you on this show is exactly the nitty-gritty stuff you need to hear. I haven't edited it. I haven't done anything like that. The only thing I've been doing is finding the best parts of this document. And honestly, most of it, like I said last time, it's just trivial stuff. But now we're starting to get into the good parts. I do feel that is true. And when we left off, I had a couple of misgivings about some of the stuff that Laurence was saying, and I still have not been able to find any information on this interview with Alistair Brythorn. It just does not exist. And there's a couple of other things that we'll get into this episode that really, really stick with me as being strange. But we'll talk to them after this episode, and I have a lot of really cool announcements to give you guys after we've done some reading. But you're not here to listen to me just waffle on about, all the radio station stuff that goes on, all of the conspiracies. But I've got a couple of really cool announcements, a couple of really good shows to go over. And at the end of it, you guys are going to want to hear so much more. Because this goes deep, ladies and gentlemen. It goes deep. Now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode. In the next session of the Laurence Michael mystery and his mysterious interview with Alistair Brythorn. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy. When I was a boy, I used to go camping with my parents. Not anywhere glamorous or fancy, not even on a woodland trip or rural campsite. No, just a crappy little campsite somewhere just outside of St Austell in Cornwall. If you've ever been camping in England, you've probably seen campsites just like this. The type with crappy canvas tents that barely keep out the rain. Neon green and pink guy ropes that you just can't help but trip over at least once during your trip there. A tuck shop that sells crappy £1 bubble bottles. A pub that sells chili nuts in those little turnkey machines for way too much money. I hated it. But I loved it all the same. Spending time with my parents with a little handheld aerial television we'd brought from a boot fair one year was special to me. I used to sit in the back part of my tent trying to pick up something of worth on this little telly, which in the early 2000s was probably Doctor Who or some random game show. I wonder if it's still there, the campsite, just like it always was. I wonder if there were any campers out there when everything turned wrong. Was it just the city centres that got hit? Did those people wake up one morning to find that the world around them had just fallen apart? You're probably wondering why I'm bringing this up when just a page or two ago I was talking about my trip to Wales to meet with the Brythorns for a one-to-one face-off. Simply put, nostalgia in a wicked sense. I remember my dad and mum packing up the car in the early evening of the day before, and then waking up at the crack of dawn to make the long drive all the way from Ringmer to Cornwall. Well, I say long, it was only about 3 to 4 hours, but that's how time works as a kid, right? The world warps around you, colours burn brighter, time flows slower. Weaker hands, and yet the grip on life is so much stronger. And now those days are gone, melted away in the back of my mind like... I remember the morning I left for my hotel in Cardiff. A morning just like those days with Mum and Dad. The brisk, late February spring air crystallizing in front of my face as I locked my front door behind me. Unlike my childhood, though, there was no comfort in this journey. No sleeping on the back seat, counting the streetlights as they passed. No sucking on a polo mint to keep my travel sickness at bay, or the soft breeze from my dad's open window. Just 4 hours of driving into the unknown, and into the arms of the people I knew wanted nothing more than to silence me for good. But I wasn't about to stay silent, and I think they knew that too. I'd give anything to be back in simpler times, but the truth is that those times would never come to pass again. You cannot steal time back from those who took it from you. But in the case of my parents, I was going to make damn sure someone paid that debt. The drive was quiet at first. Not many cars even took the roads this far south anymore, since everyone had fled so far north. But there was still a small amount of traffic on the M25 that morning. More than I expected, to be honest. It was a sobering realization of the scale of the disaster the country had experienced. Driving past endless sets of blocked-off junctions, Sevenoaks was sealed, Crawley sealed, Guildford sealed. The process of walling off the south coast had been long, arduous, and filled with logistical nightmares, as most things that come out of a government this out of control would be. I'd even managed to write a couple of articles on that topic, ruffled a few feathers of some of the MPs, that resulted in snotty letters about focusing on maintaining the spirit of the British people, which in polite terms meant I needed to shut the fuck up about how miserable everything was. It was entirely expected, to be honest. Everyone was moving on and trying to ignore the fact that several thousand people had potentially watched or heard about their loved ones literally melting into a pool of blood. I don't and will not negate anyone's decision to move on and try to put a thought like that out of their mind, especially when I had had to go through the same experience as them. But this was my chance to move on. If no one else was going to say something, I would have to do it. And as the days had gone on, I had felt that gnawing compulsion, that invisible leash around my neck pulling me closer and closer to what I thought was the truth. As if my fate was preordained, pre-written. I had to know the truth. And I had to know why. It was then, about halfway through my journey, not even that I reached my first obstacle. I'd planned my route heavily in advance, but had failed to account for the fact that while the red wave had slowed dramatically since the quarantine, it was still an active threat to be combated. There were many things I could criticize Principium for, but their efficiency was seemingly not one of them. So, as I reached Junction 15 and hoped to turn onto the M4 towards Slough and Reading, I was met with a familiar sight. Those damned Principium trucks and armed officers. My heart stopped, and I swiftly pulled up to the side of the road and approached the blockade. I felt history repeating itself almost to a fault. 2 men stood, armed and ready to fire, holding their hands up. I paused and waited until they explained that there had been apparent sightings of the virus in Slough, and so the whole area was to be sealed off. My whole body began to shake, and instantly I was back home, fearing for my parents' lives. These men, this company, had taken everything from me, and now they were continuing to do so, and everyone was turning the other way, as if their minds were not their own. I grit my teeth and sternly explained to them who I was, and that I was heading to the Principium headquarters and research facility in Wales, and that if I did not get there on time, it would be on their shit-eating heads. I felt quite proud of myself for that one. Felt almost cathartic to spit even a small amount of vitriol at someone wearing Principium's colours. But that didn't last long. No. The world had other ideas. And soon I felt like the whole world had slipped away from me. Yes, Laurence. We know who you are. Lord Alistair eagerly awaits your visit. Do try to be on time, one of them said, an almost drab, monotonous tone flowing from his mouth. The two men were staring at me dead in the face now. An absence of emotion, an absence of thought? No. They were cognizant, stoic, but stable, fingers firmly on triggers, and yet they looked at me with unfamiliar eyes. I took a step back, almost bewildered as my heart jumped into my throat. Two random soldiers in the middle of a roadblock, the M25, seemingly knew about my visit? I mean, I had no doubt that they'd probably recognize my face, but my destination, my intention, even if I hadn't told them? How did they know? How could they know? Who were these people? I picked myself up as quickly as I could, shaking the fear away, and stood tall, demanding that they explain themselves immediately. But with a blink, that unfamiliarity faded, and soon they looked at me confused. They explained that they'd told me where the next available exit was and how to get to Cardiff. They'd told me to drive further and go via Oxford, heading on to Gloucester, Newport, and then eventually to Cardiff. They still had a glassy-eyed look, but they felt different again. I couldn't figure out what I was seeing, but was I exhausted? Were they? Were they overworked? I don't know. But I wasn't about to press them, and even if I could, what was I to do? They had guns, and I'm just a journalist. So I shook myself out of my worries as best I could, and got back in my car and drove away. But as I glanced in my mirror, I could have sworn that I saw every guardsman at that checkpoint staring at me. The rest of the journey was silent. 100 miles in, my mind was racing with thoughts of what was possibly going on around me, and what I was driving into the middle of. I could feel the jaws of something massive closing around me, and my eyes began to drift. I was exhausted. I was tired. I'd been driving since the early hours of the day. So I pulled into a small side road somewhere in the Cotswolds and rested for a moment. I hadn't slept right in weeks, even less so since that original call had come in from Rachel. Those flowing oceans of red that seemed to dance their way into drains in my mind. Blood soaking into the soil, turning the world a bitter red. and beyond that world, an endless void of black water, knee-deep and unfathomably wide. I'd had this same dream over and over again every night, and it always goes the same way. Things watching me from that pale abyss, smiling at me with faces unseen. And then a golden light, warming and fills me with a sense of hope and levity. A chance to be whole again, to forget everything that's going on, and I follow it away from that broken red world. And in the distance I can see it, that beautiful land beyond, a golden tree. And then something grips my leg, and I wake. I cannot tell you how long I'd been asleep at the wheel of my car for that night, but the sound of the knocking on my window shook me from whatever that nightmare I was experiencing was, and I looked up to see a very concerned-looking local policeman just peering through my window. I can't imagine what he thought of what he saw. A grim-faced, scruffy-looking man with bloodshot eyes and sweat pouring down his face. I can't really blame him for checking in on me. He told me that some hikers earlier in the day from the local village had spotted my car and thought I was either dead or on some form of substance. I laughed and shook my head. The sight of an honest-to-God, normal human being filled with innocence was almost like a panacea to my worries. I explained to him my situation about my commute and that I was just stressing myself out about everything. He was understanding, thoughtful, and explained that I couldn't really park there and I would have to move along shortly. But if I needed to rest longer, there was a local pub I could stop by, and there was a car park for a bit more of a kip. He smiled at me, and for a moment I thought I saw a shimmer in his eye. I refused the offer, telling him that I was already running late as it was and that I should probably get moving. I checked my watch as the policeman walked away. 3 hours had passed, and yet I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I couldn't waste any more time, so I started my car up and made the last third of my journey, through to Cardiff and to my hotel. It was nothing expensive, just a simple bed and breakfast not far from the dockyards. Didn't have to be fancy, I wasn't planning on staying long. The staff were nice enough, set me up with a nice room overlooking the bay. One of them even recognized me and was curious what brought me all the way out here. Given my experience at the roadblock, I thought it poignant to not disclose what my plan was, and simply told her that I was covering the effects of life on the Welsh coast, given its proximity to the quarantine zone. On a good day, you see, Weston-super-Mare could be spotted across the sea, recorded as one of the bloodiest and most violent evacuations of the time, which might be a shock to anyone who comes from there. Wasn't exactly the biggest place, and yet, strangely, it was the darkest day. They just locked themselves away. They apparently had refused to work with Principium and the Brythorns, and so they were simply locked away and waited to die. Horrifying. Meanwhile, here on the southern coast of Wales, everything had been fine, according to the member of staff I'd spoken to. She told me that Principium and the Brythorns had always done right by Wales, and Alistair had actually studied medicine at the University of Wales, there in Cardiff. He'd been seen around the town a lot, always an eccentric lad, but one that always did right by the city, like the other members of his family, especially Lord Ambrose. He had a good head on his shoulders, apparently, and actively helped the local community in any way he could. I couldn't believe my ears when she told me this, and she was being sincere too, not some PR gubbins designed to throw me off course. It was strange that the Briarthorn family, as far as I was aware, were from the Highlands. Why did they have such interest on this coast? I decided it was best to leave those thoughts until I was on my own, but she got a couple of other locals to speak to me and confirmed her accounts. They all had nothing but good things to say about Alistair, Ambrose, or the Briarthorns in general. Either the whole city was blind, or Alistair had changed dramatically since leaving university. For a moment, I felt almost connected to him in a way, as if our lives had walked similar courses, but I shook the feeling away without a second thought and let the staff take me to my room. Once set up, I decided to do a bit more digging on Principium. The taste in my mouth was bitter from the conversation I'd had with the staff. So I looked up the research facility and what I could expect to find on them. You know, typical journalistic integrity. Know thy enemy. As expected, their website was my first port of call, and was as professional and hollow as you'd expect. Nothing says PR bollocks like the Principium Corporation prides itself on providing experimental solutions to the modern medical world, and nonsensical business statements such as, we embrace the antithetical to reshape the known. I rolled my eyes at least twice per paragraph on that website. Whoever wrote it was equally as egotistical as the higher-ups, and really just sounded like they wanted the Briarthorns to sound like a villain. That's not to say everything on that page was useless, however, as there was an entire section on the history of the research facility and why it was where it was. The main research facility, known as the Dunraven Tower, had been built upon the grounds of the old Dunraven Castle and walled gardens in the early 2000s, with its ownership being traced back to an acquisition of the land and the castle grounds by the Briarthorn family as early as 1890, when the deed to the land was purchased on their behalf by a Leopold Kraus as a thank you for the continued economic relationship between their houses. Once again, the Briarthorns proved to me that they have many strings to pull, and all the more reason why the Principium Corporation strikes me as more than just a good-natured pharmaceutical research group. Not that I ever considered them as such in the first place, mind you. I researched for what felt like an eternity, my head spinning as I spiraled through an endless maze of web pages and biographies and historical documents, tracking everything from Alistair Briarthorn's rise to power as CEO to the foundations of Principium themselves. I resorted to drink, cigarette breaks, strolling up and down the length of my room from sundown to sunrise. Anything to avoid sleeping. Anything to avoid seeing that bleeding world again. But eventually my feet could no longer stand, and I collapsed into bed. I wish I knew how long I'd slept for, but it could have not been long at all before the sound of commotion downstairs woke me. I could hear the sound of muffled, panicked shouting, followed by running footsteps up and down the corridor over and over and over again. I quickly put some clothes on, freshened up, and peered my head out of the door to see what the situation was, coming face to face with the woman I had spoken to the night before. Her face had gone pale, and she looked at me as if she'd seen a ghost. I knew that look. I knew the face of someone who had glimpsed death. I tried to calm her, but her hysterics were beyond belief. When I finally managed to get her to speak, she told me that people had returned from a morning jog along the beach and that there was something wrong with the water, before rushing off in tears. I rushed out of the building without another word, following a rush of people and the din of conversation as people quickly amassed outside to overlook the bay and the Bristol Channel, their mouths agape with what they could see and what now I beheld. Across the water, the quarantine zone was burning. Plumes of fire and smoke high enough to see from across the water. Bristol, Weston-super-Mare, everything in sight was burning. But that wasn't the worst. No. For as my eyes glanced towards the sea, I saw what the staff woman had meant. Slowly seeping across those waves was a layer of thick, bubbling scarlet. Blood. The Bristol Channel was turning to blood. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, another exciting and absolutely mind-bending entry from the Journal of Laurence Michael. What an episode, ladies and gentlemen. Can you even believe some of the stuff we're hearing in here? There is so much to go over, so much to talk about. I can't believe it. You know, when I read it through the first time, I thought I was going as crazy as Laurence was. I'm sorry to say, but, you know, some of the stuff in here, as we'll get into, he does sound like he's going a bit crazy, you know. There is definitely something going very, very wrong in his mind at this point. And it's sad, you know, it's sad to see someone go this way. You know, if we saw a loved one go this way, I think it would just be an absolute travesty. So I think it's important that we feel the same about Laurence in this situation. It's weird, the disconnect reading this as well, you know? It's like reading a storybook, you know? Like, I know this person, sort of, you know, a bit parasocial of me to say, but, you know, I know this person because we've seen his journey, we've seen his articles, we've seen the things that he went through live. You know, we read these newspapers, I've seen the newspapers, but just to see his descent on paper, it doesn't feel real, you know? So it's crazy. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time in the office recently. You know, I haven't left recently. I've been working hard on this. I think it's been a couple of days at most. It's been a couple of days since I last kind of left the office. Don't worry, I've seen the sun. I've just been so intent on, you know, reading through this journal and making sure that everything is correct that I just slept at the office, you know, slept in my studio. It's comfy in here, it's big, there's enough room to just like take a nap. It's been a busy couple of days, and since you guys love this show so much, I just had to make sure that it was going right, you know. But anyway, enough about that kind of, you know, slightly sobering reality that I've spent the past couple of days sitting in my studio. But let's just, you know, let's get into the actual breakdown of Laurence's journey on this one, because there is so much to unpack in this section. I mean, first of all, he is losing his mind a little bit. You know, this encounter with the guards just outside of Slough, you know, that's a huge thing. You know, he talks about them speaking to him directly as if they have knowledge that was just delivered to them in a way, like they weren't speaking that their mind is their own. But he says it himself. He says that he hasn't slept very well, that he's having weird dreams of, like, you know, voids and blood soaking into the soil and everything. It's worrying, you know. He's speaking quite quite darkly about these things. It's obvious that the trauma that he's been through, and that, you know, we all went through, it's a lot, and it's getting to him. And to pull it back a little bit and, you know, talk about the kind of, you know, having sadness and pity for other people, you know, I'm very sorry for everyone who, you know, had the misfortune of having to go camping in Cornwall. You know, that's not an experience I ever had. But if that is something that you had to go through, you know, maybe you'd be as, you know, traumatized as Laurence here. It's crazy. No, seriously though, I think him taking a moment to say that, you know, I haven't slept very well, that everything's been kind of going a little bit badly for him is an understatement, but it also kind of helps explain why he's kind of going a bit loopy here. And, you know, it's sad. It's obvious that he needed some sleep, and he needed some medication more than anything. And then we have his whole journey to Cardiff, and, you know, getting all kind of situated and everything. And there's a couple of really, really interesting things that really stood out to me in this part. So if you're one of those people who I know listens to the show and has their notepads out and is taking notes furiously, perhaps this is one for the books for you lot. They mention a gentleman by the name of Leopold Krauss, the one who bought the Dunraven Castle for the Briarthorn family, which is interesting because I could have sworn I've heard that name before, the castle I mean. But Krauss that family is familiar to us. You know, if you've been a long-term listener to the show, you've heard mention of the Krauss family, a German aristocratic family and group that they sponsor everything from, you know, museum, you know, pieces to archaeological digs. We've had evidence of them operating in China, in Egypt, Tunisia. There's even talk of an Antarctic expedition, but we've got no paperwork on that. So maybe that's something we can look into the future, especially now that we know that they have a connection to the Briarthorn family. And speaking of the Briarthorn family, what a crazy talk about their past. You know, I did a little bit of digging, and yeah, Alistair did have a quite prominent place in Cardiff in his youth. He was a popular figure. He was a very strapping young man looking at these pictures of him. But yeah, he really just looked after the city. He cared about it a lot. The Briarthorn estate in general did a lot for Cardiff and the south coast of Wales in general, which, you know, it is highlighted and is strange. As Laurence said, they're from the Highlands. I don't know what it is about the south of Wales. Maybe it's the Bristol Bay that they really like, the Bristol Channel. I've never been. He said it himself. I think it's the Bristol Channel. But, you know, it's not a place I really see the charm in. Not saying it's a bad place, of course, but just, it doesn't make sense to me. But that brings us on to our last part, which is about this whole business of, one, the quarantine zone burning, and two, blood seeping into the Bristol Channel and turning it red. Those events, I'm just gonna put it bluntly, never happened. All right, we would have heard about this. That would have been major news, even if there was like a massive cover-up by Principium. There is nothing they could have done to handle a outbreak of that style. And in general, Cardiff and the Welsh, South Wales coast would have been quarantined. They're not, as far as I'm aware. But, just to be sure, just to make absolutely sure, we are a show of integrity and truth, we are going to look it up right now on my laptop. I have my laptop here, just if I want to check everything. We already looked at very charming pictures of Alistair Briarthorn with copious amounts of ladies in a bar somewhere. But let's just look it up, but it didn't happen. I'm just going to put it out there. It did not happen. The Bristol Channel did not fill with blood. The quarantine zone is still there, and okay. I don't know how I missed this one. Top result, Bristol Channel filling with blood, quarantine zone burning, thousands presumed dead. See, now that's thrown me for a bit of a loop there, ladies and gentlemen, because we lived through this. I lived through this. I came from what is now the quarantine zone. My family did. I think we would have heard if everything we knew and loved had burnt down and the Bristol Channel, an entire section of the ocean, turned to blood. We would have remembered that. That was a thing that would have happened. Would have been all over the news. So I mean, this is there's reputable sources out there that say it. Every newspaper, now that I'm looking at it, I searched this and there was nothing on it. There was a lot of people discussing it, but the search results have just changed in front of me. That's how strange. Maybe I need some sleep. Maybe I need some sleep, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, I have been working on this for a while. I don't know if I ever told the story of where this journal even came from. I came into the office one day. I came into the studio. I sat down in my little booth here in the studio, and it was here, just with a little note on it saying, provided by anonymous source. Get reading. Apparently some of the other members of staff brought it in, and I wasn't about to question it because we verified its integrity. We verified that it was real, and it was here, which is crazy. That says to me that whatever this is important, and it appears to have some truths to it that we hadn't seen before. So, hey, all the best for Deadman Radio, am I right? All the best for the search for truth. But yeah, it's a crazy document, and I can't wait to hear what you guys have to think. So be sure to tune in next week for the next episode of this little series, when we will be opening up our phone lines. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be opening up the phone lines to hear your thoughts on the complete Laurence Michael story. Right now, however, it's that I'll be honest. The whole thing with the Bristol Channel has definitely shaken me up a little bit, so I think I'm going to go take a cigarette. I'm going to go, have a walk, have a break, and then we'll be back with a little bit more conversation. But first, I hate to do it to you. If you hate listening to me talk, you're going to hate this next song. We're going to go back with the Sourceless Wonders, whose new album comes out in a couple of days, and God forbid anyone purchases that album. Now, I'm going to go take a break. Enjoy the music, I guess. But ladies and gentlemen, my name's been Alex Stake. You're listening to the one and only radio station that matters in this day and age, Deadman Radio. See you in a few. You're here today and would like to see more, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel so that you can get updates whenever new episodes release. You can also follow Renee on Twitter and Blue Sky if you would like to see more information on artwork, writing, or elsewhere. If you feel the need to, and would like to support further episodes, you can also consider donating to our Patreon to get extra little benefits such as access to scripts, or early looks at what is coming next in the PARAVERSE. Thank you, everyone, for listening.